Why do startups fail? They run out of money and they can't raise more. But that's too simple, right? It's like saying the victim died from loss of blood. So many different things could have happened. And and we need to invest. We need to dig deeper and keep asking why. Why did you run out of money? Why couldn't you raise more?
So we have with us an amazing guest, Tom Eisenmann. So he is a researcher, a professor, Howard H. Stevenson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. And to anyone who's curious to learn why startups fail and what to do about it, and in whichever stage in the journey you are in, this will be an interesting conversation to have. With that, Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Awesome. So to start, walk us through your journey. Like, what brought you to this researching the world of failures and startup failures?
Well, what brought me to this point was being a failure at explaining failure. So it turns out, depending on how you define startup and how you define failure, something like 2/3 of startups fail. That's in the United States. 2/3 of startups that raise venture capital don't generate a positive return for investors, and at some level that's a failure, right? If you don't get money back to the investors, you failed at least in one way. And 8 years ago, former students of mine had launched a venture. I thought it was a fantastic idea. I had encouraged them. I coached them on the idea. I actually was an investor in the company, and they raised $1 million. They wanted to raise $1.5 million. That's part of the failure story. They did exactly what I taught them in business school. Many of your listeners will be familiar with a movement called lean startup, which is essentially applying the scientific method to startups, to have an assumption as an entrepreneur and then come up with a rigorous but very efficient test. Sort of waste no more effort than you need to get a rigorous signal on whether your hypothesis is right or not. And they did this. This was an apparel company. So they were two tall women who had trouble finding clothes that fit them well, work clothes. And so they wanted to produce stylish, affordable, and here's the key, better fitting work apparel. It's pretty easy to do two of those three things. It's very difficult to do all three of them. And they ran tests. There's in the fashion business, there's a thing called a trunk show. So you literally bring in a trunk full of samples, and you get a group of customers, women in this case, and they try on the samples and they place orders. This is classic lean startup tests, sort of show somebody an early version of the product and see if they'll buy it. And they did. They purchased the apparel in large numbers, gave the founders the confidence to quit their consulting jobs. They stepped away from BCG and launched the company. So they'd done minimum viable product tests, lean testing, launched the business. Sales were indeed strong, and repeat purchases were strong, which is very important. But they had trouble producing apparel that fit well. So the rates of return of the merchandise, it was sold over the internet, direct to consumer business model. The returns were not crazy high. They were on a par with other e-commerce sites. But if your promise is better fit, that's not good enough. And it costs money to process the returns. You have to ship a new version of the article and so forth. And so they burned through their capital pretty rapidly. And while they were making progress, they couldn't raise, to my first point about startups fail because they run out of money and they can't raise more. They couldn't raise more, had to shut the business down after a year. And so I could point to a lot of things that went wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint the root cause of the failure. And that was upsetting to me. And so I set out to, I was a failure at explaining failure, set out to learn everything I could about what did academics say, what did smart practitioners, entrepreneurs and investors say about why startups fail. I interviewed dozens and dozens of failed founders and the investors who backed them, read everything that was ever written on the subject. And 8 years later, here we are. I have a book.
So, what is tell us what is fascinating about failures? Like, what is fascinating when it comes to startup and failure that you found?
Well, it's fascinating that it's complicated. Number one, we are wired up as humans to oversimplify explanations, both for good things and bad things. And when you talk to people about failure, you see that oversimplification. Philosophers call it the single cause fallacy. And anybody that's taken a psychology course has studied something called the fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error works like this. If somebody cuts you off, somebody driving a BMW cuts you off, you think that person's a self-centered jerk. If you cut somebody off when you're driving, you think, oh my, there's a blind spot in my car. There's really bad designers at Volvo. I got to be more careful, but what really wasn't my fault. So the fundamental attribution error is if somebody else did it, it's a problem with their skill or will, their attitude, their motivation. And if I do something wrong, it's circumstances not really under my control. My co-founder dropped the ball. The venture capitalist pushed me to follow a flawed strategy, whatever. Or a pandemic hit and my business didn't have a chance. So that's fascinating. So to really untangle what actually happened when you have these flawed explanations, either from the third party or the first person account, to really make sense of what happened is a puzzle. You have to be a detective to understand, and that's why the book is built around case studies. It's how we teach at Harvard Business School. So it's all teaching around case studies, and a good case study will surround the problem from many perspectives.
Interesting. So failures is yours and winnings are mine. So that's a pretty interesting take. So what are I'm curious to know what are some of the misconceptions when it comes to failure or our understanding of failure in context of startup? Like, do you know of some?
Yeah, no, I think the biggest misconception is so investors and sometimes entrepreneurs will talk about jockey and horse. The jockey is the founder, and the horse is the concept, the opportunity. And investors will debate which is more important. But I would say a majority of investors, if forced to choose, obviously you want both. It would be wonderful to have a fast horse and a very talented jockey. But if you have to choose, most investors would choose the jockey. And the reverse of that, if a company struggles, if it fails, they will blame the jockey. It goes back to the fundamental attribution error. So I think that is the biggest mistake. And then the notion that it's one problem when in fact it's often a constellation of things going wrong, and added together they can kill a company.
Interesting. And so whenever we talk about failures, we often so there are great books like Good to Great, and basically we celebrate success, right? We celebrate success and we shame failures, right? So if you are a startup, and I think you touched upon in your book as well that many times you basically you push it further. You have no end in sight. You keep pursuing it. How do you, like, when you look at startups where the idea of failure is sort of looked up or frowned upon when it comes to your progression? When you study failures for startups, like where do your mind come at peace at this? Whether it's an opportunity to learn and pivot, or whether it's a shameful deceit that you have to run away from and not fail.
Yeah, the stigma of failure varies a great deal by culture. So I think it's stigmatized everywhere. People in the United States, particularly on the coasts, right, West Coast and East Coast, will say that it's tolerated, and I think in fact it is tolerated to a greater extent than in other parts of the world. You don't want to be a failure in Japan or France. I just gave a presentation to the Harvard clubs in India and heard that in India it's very difficult to fail. um, and people will hide it and avoid it if they can. So, but then you look at the United States. I would say China has a pretty aggressive entrepreneurial culture, and in some ways, very similar to the United States. So it does vary, and we also should draw a distinction between um, failures, daily failures along the way. I mean, every individual, every business has small failures, and a goal should be to learn from those, and draw the distinction between those and the big failure, the one that leads to the extinction of the organization. And so that's what the book is about. The book is not about the small failures; it's about the big one, the one that ends the venture. And so, what's tricky about learning from failure is, philosophers would tell you the only way you learn is if you can fail, right? If everything goes according to plan, and it's not obviously you've learned anything new, right? You had a plan, it worked. You were exactly. I mean, maybe you have more confidence in your plan now. Maybe your assumptions. You have more confidence in your assumptions about cause and effect relationships, but you haven't learned much. When something fails, either in a small way or a big way, now you have to figure out, okay, I had some assumptions and they were wrong. So what went wrong? And it forces you to go on a quest to sort of figure out. Was it something you did? Was it a mistaken sense of cause and effect? And the trick with the big failure, the failure that ends the company, is it can often take years. And so we learn best from failure when feedback cycles are fast. You make a move and you quickly get feedback on whether it was a smart move or not a smart move. And you learn best when you have repeated cycles, and you learn best when you have a clear sense of cause and effect relationship. So weather forecasting is a fantastic example, right? You make a forecast every day, sometimes several times a day, and you find out the next day or the next week whether you were right or not. And meteorologists have this entire system of hypotheses about what moves the weather. So, and in fact, weather forecasters get better and better over time. Stock picking a little bit like this, but much noisier cause and effect relationships, so harder to learn. The problem with an entrepreneurial venture is it can last 5 or 10 years before it either succeeds or fails. And like in any complicated human organization, there's a lot going on. So, and some of the relationships are nonlinear. So, you push on something, and and you have no idea what's going to get pushed in the distant future or so. And so it's hard for an entrepreneur to, and also there are very few repeated trials, right? Since an entrepreneur may only do this 3 times in their life. So, to learn from one failure is a very challenging thing. That's why vicarious learning is important. And when we study failure, if you go into domains like firefighting, or weather forecast, air traffic control is a good place, right? The National Traffic and Air Safety Commission will look at near misses and really analyze them in detail. And pilots learning to fly will study those carefully, because if somebody gets into trouble and then you can actually figure out what they did to prevent the trouble, that's very powerful. So the book is very much in that spirit of vicarious learning. Learn from other people's entrepreneurial failure, so you don't have to go through it yourself.
Interesting. So when I think you had a very interesting point. So I was thinking about, so I was discussing with one of the executives at WeWork a couple of months back about whatever happened with the WeWork story. Obviously, so they're beyond the startup stage, they're doing really good, and then suddenly, so they were a very good example of failures, right? So there were failures
It's a
early on.
spectacular and an epic failure.
Yeah, so they keep on pushing it, because sometimes it's good to not look at the failures and keep investing in where you're succeeding, right? and then that bubble keeps on increasing to a level where it's beyond anyone's control, and then it bursts, right? So when you I'm curious about your vantage point. So when you are, say, dealing with a startup, and there's a two purviews. One purview is, okay, I can see failures, but I can see progress. So let me just focus on the progress. We'll deal with the failure later. And then these hockey stick growth, and you talked about it, when things are working, then you don't know where you have failed. So you have not learned your lessons, due lessons. So what is your like what's your take on that?
Um, so if we look at WeWork in particular, I think WeWork is a classic example of a failure pattern in the book. The book is built around 6 failure patterns. 3 are early stage startups, first couple of years when the venture is still trying to find a product and a market that fit, and mobilizing resources, team and money and so forth. And then 3 of the failure patterns are late stage. We've got resources, we're growing, but the question is, can we continue to grow and grow profitably? And it turns out, sort of 2 out of 3 early stage startups fail. It's still the case that 1 out of 3 late stage startups fail to make money for the investors. So that's one yardstick for failure, is the investors don't get their money back. And WeWork is a classic example of that. I mean, I think it's fair. I mean, who knows? It may rebound and someday be worth $80 billion again. But it doesn't seem very likely, does it? So the people who put money in at a very, very high valuation a couple of years ago are probably never going to get that money back. And in that sense, it is a failure. And I think it's an example of a failure pattern I call speed trap. So just like the policeman with the radar gun at the side of the road, and the speed limit is 40 miles an hour and you're going 65, you can get in trouble. And growth is a tricky thing. It's one of what you asked, what surprised me about failure. It turns out sometimes the things you need to do to succeed as an entrepreneur, grow, are also the things that can cause you to fail as an entrepreneur, grow too fast, grow unprofitably. And I mean, in some ways, because Adam was such a charismatic founder, he was able to dazzle investors, and raise money at a gigantic valuation by painting this vision of a future that was very compelling. But really, if you dug into it, they were leasing real estate and sort of dividing it into smaller pieces and releasing it, hopefully at a higher price. That business can work, but is it worth tens of billions of dollars? Doesn't seem like it. Is it a tech company that warrants a tech company valuation? Doesn't seem like it. And so I think this is probably evident to some people, but not enough people. And it only takes a few investors, really excited. Once you have that money, and you've raised it at a very high valuation, to get the next round of money, you actually have to achieve some measure of success in order to raise the next round of money at a higher share price. And if you don't, you then have what entrepreneurs call a down round, which is a disaster. A down round is a signal to everybody in the company, everybody with stock options, that maybe their precious stock options are never going to be valuable. People will leave, and a company can unravel very quickly after a down round. So how do you sustain the valuation, keep getting steps up? You need to do whatever the capital market investors are looking for. In this case, grow. So take all that capital, the billions you've raised, and plow it into more buildings and more leases and more marketing and so forth. But it wasn't profitable growth. And the question is, how long can an entrepreneur delude themselves into thinking that, well, yeah, we're losing money now, but maybe we can raise the prices in the future. Maybe we can sell other services to these tenants. Maybe we can renegotiate the underlying lease with the building owner. Maybe. And it can go for a while, but it can't go forever.
That's a very, very interesting take. So on that note, so Theranos is another example of a colossal failures, right? So now, when you talk about maybe selection bias or abundance bias, so you have market that is aching to find the next gem and stand behind it and support it, and then you somehow get this vision that somehow appears to be not far fetched. It somehow look achievable. So, from your vantage point, when one is putting out a startup and they are progressing, they're growing it, there are many things which are pretty beehive or beehog, and then some things are achievable. So, from your vantage point, how do you decipher that, from the failure context, that some things are meant, it may happen or may not happen, but it's not too far of a fetch to claim that you have a strong shot at it. I'm curious about your
Yeah. So
perspective.
so this is a second late stage failure pattern that I talk about in the book. I call it cascading miracles, and I love the term. I learned the
Mm.
term from John Malone, who was the entrepreneur who built TCI, was the biggest U.S. cable television system operator, and he got it from a boss of his from General Instruments, Marty Shapiro. And the notion is there are certain ventures, certain things in life where many things have to go right. So think of a mathematical equation where you're going to multiply A times B times C times D. And if they all go right, you get a big jackpot, a big payoff. But if any of the elements are zero, A or B or C, the whole equation goes to zero. And the same thing with a venture, right? So many things have to go right. If anything goes wrong, the venture fails. But if everything goes right, it's a gigantic payoff. And so you need a cascade of miracles. And so and we can come back to Theranos, but the case study in the book that illustrates this phenomenon is a company called Better Place. Better Place wanted to create a network of charging stations for electric vehicles all around the world. They raised $900 million. The plan was actually, in addition to sort of stationary charging stations like the one you might have in your garage, or in a parking lot, they were going to create battery swapping stations where a car would drive in, a robot would pull out the depleted battery and pop in a fresh battery, and do all that in 5 minutes. Of course, you needed the cars to be designed with swappable batteries, which means you got to get General Motors and Ford and Fiat and every car company on the planet to redesign their cars, which is a big deal. And so that's uncertainty number one. Can we get the OEMs, the car manufacturers, to change their designs? Uncertainty number two, will people embrace electric vehicles? That wasn't clear when Better Place launched, which was 2010. They did, so that one went right. Will government subsidize electric vehicles? Was really important to early success. They did. He got that one right. Can we raise $1 billion to get this business started? 900 million to be more precise. Charismatic founder Shai Agassi, every bit as charismatic as Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos or Adam Neumann at WeWork. He did, so got that right. Will customers embrace the battery swapping approach as opposed to fast charging? So if you have a Tesla and you want to go from city to city, there's now networks of fast charging stations out there. They charge the batteries like 4 times faster or 5 times faster, but they do a little bit of damage to the battery, so you don't want to do it every time. And that turned out to be a better approach than swapping with robots. And so on like this, and sort of actually they deployed the network in Denmark and Israel, but it turned out to be incredibly difficult to encourage. They thought adoption would be high in Israel because almost everybody drives a company car. So if you could just persuade the corporations to do this, then you wouldn't have to do one consumer at a time. But the cars ended up costing just as much as on a fully loaded basis as gasoline-powered cars. So there's no saving for the company, no saving for the consumer, and a lot of inconvenience. Sort of the danger that if the car only had a range of 100 miles, which was the range at that time, you could find yourself stranded. So anyway, you needed a cascade of miracles, and some happened, but several didn't, and the company failed and lost $900 million. Theranos, I think, is an example of cascading miracles. Sometimes they work. Vishal, Tesla is an example. SpaceX is an example. Elon Musk seems to specialize in getting cascades of miracles. Federal Express, if you go back to the early 1970s, at the time was the biggest venture capital launch in history. And people thought Fred Smith, the entrepreneur who built it, was insane. Like, why would you, if you're shipping a package from Buffalo, New York to Cleveland, Ohio, why would you send it to Memphis, Tennessee, and then back to Cleveland? That's hub and spoke was considered crazy. And the amount of capital, he'd have to have his own fleet of planes. In those days, you put a package on the belly of a commercial, a passenger plane. So anyway, that's cascading miracles. And they often, because the development cycle is so long for the products, you need a charismatic entrepreneur who can mesmerize the investors, employees, partners, and so forth. And often it works, but sometimes there's this fine line between persuasion and cult. With Steve Jobs, we talked about a reality distortion field where he was so mesmerizing that he could persuade people by painting a vision of a better future to do the impossible. Join with him, work 80-hour weeks for a year, which is what the Macintosh team did, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes that field, the reality distortion field, will fold back on itself and keep the entrepreneur actually from seeing reality.
Interesting. So now, another interesting example that I'm curious to have a perspective on is, say, BlackBerry. So during the BlackBerry downfall, I spoke to a bunch of their product managers, right, about what's going on inside, how are things looking inside, and they all saying, hey, we were meeting our numbers, we were asked to do something, we realized but the market itself changed underneath, right? So how do you grapple with that fact when you're succeeding in what you do, but somehow something else happened and accidentally jumped over, and then you got smacked? What's your take on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, well, failures are often, as I said in the beginning, they're complicated, and sometimes they are a complicated mix of mistakes and misfortunes. So, and I suspect BlackBerry may have seen some of that. I mean, an example I think in the book that illustrates this well is a company called Jibo. Jibo still is, they still exist some out there, a social robot, an amazing little device about a foot tall. It didn't walk or roll. It was stationary, but it had 3 separate segments that could move in very expressive ways. It could twerk, if everybody knows what that means. And what was unique about, so it came out of the MIT Media Labs. Cynthia Brazil was the scientist, and she'd been working on social robotics her entire career, really was a pioneer of the field. Originally to get robots that would engage the elderly, to keep them intellectually stimulated, or autistic children who might have trouble relating to a human, but they would talk to a robot. So that was the vision for Jibo. They couldn't sell it as a product for the elderly, so they turned it into a product that you'd put in your kitchen, and your surly teenagers who otherwise wouldn't speak to parents, if there's a third party in between, maybe the robot could help the teenagers and the parents talk to each other. And what was distinctive about Jibo is it would actually initiate a conversation. Tom, I told you this morning the commute was going to be heavier than usual. How did it go? When I came home from work, and people would build a real emotional connection to Jibo. Jibo was originally conceived in a crowdfunding campaign, Indiegogo campaign, promised within 15 months for $500. Took about 2.5 years to produce, and it came out at $900 because it was much harder to design, especially the software. The hardware actually worked remarkably smoothly. It was the software that turned out to be a big problem. And while all that was happening, Amazon launches the Echo smart speaker with Alexa inside for $200. Nobody saw it coming. No one saw. We kind of expected voice assistants to be in our phone because of Siri and so forth, but nobody saw smart speakers coming. It took the tech world by surprise. And Jibo, now priced at $900, was both your friend and an egg timer, or a weatherman. It provided the same utility as Alexa, but it also did this other thing. So would there be enough people that want the emotional connection to a mechanical other? And the answer was no, not at $900. So some people loved it. They actually held wakes for Jibo when the servers shut down. But that's a misfortune, and the entrepreneurs could not have seen it coming. And so Jibo was killed by some mistakes that the team made, but also by a big misfortune.
Fascinating story. So, so have you seen graceful failures? So, failing gracefully. So, do you have some
Yeah.
examples where if there is a failing, it should be done like this?
Yeah, that's actually exactly the term I use in the book. I teach a course at Harvard Business School on entrepreneurial failure, and we teach the students what are the elements of a graceful failure, and a graceful failure. A few things are true. You, the entrepreneur, communicate openly and transparently to all the stakeholders. It won't be a surprise to you that many entrepreneurs, when they fail, they sort of dive into a hole, and because of the stigma of failure, and they're not eager to communicate with anyone. And so it's the responsibility of the entrepreneur to communicate clearly to customers, to partners, to suppliers, to investors, all the way what happened, and most importantly, what's going to happen to you, employee, to vendor, are you going to be paid? Investor, are you going to get any money back? So communicating is important. Paying people who are owed money is the second aspect. So most startups will owe people money, lawyers, suppliers. Customers may have placed deposits. Employees may have a check coming. So everybody that's owed money it gets the money in full. Not necessarily investors, right? People who hold equity may get back 10 cents on the dollar, and that's better than nothing. But paying everybody who's owed money is another element of a graceful shutdown, as is with employees, being very clear with them on what happens. Will your medical benefits be covered? Helping them get a job. So that's the second element. And then the third element of a graceful shutdown is an entrepreneur who's actually learned something from the experience. And it's not surprisingly, I mean, it can be an emotional battering. An entrepreneur is the company is the entrepreneur. The identities are intertwined. And so when the startup fails, it's inescapable for the entrepreneur that a big part of them has failed, and that hurts. So you see guilt and shame and anger and regret and every emotion you can imagine. And when those emotions are so strong, it can be very difficult to learn anything, right? They cloud your ability to sort of make sense of a situation. So the entrepreneur has to let the emotions calm, and that takes some time and some distance. Best way to do that, to recover and heal, is to alternate between ruminating, which is inevitable, and you're only going to learn if you think about what happened, and finding some distraction. Because if you do rumination 100% of the time, you will literally make yourself crazy. I mean, you'll probably become clinically depressed. And so they have to find this balance between distraction and rumination, and let time heal. Find a side project, do some exercise, whatever it is, some yoga. And then the challenge of learning from a failure is there are two responses. One is probably more common than the other. The common response, it goes back to the fundamental attribution error, is to blame other people. Wasn't my fault. My co-founder lost attention. My investors pushed me in the wrong direction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you chose the co-founder. You chose the investors, so at some level, you've got to take some responsibility for those kinds of choices. Sometimes it is truly out of your control. I mean, COVID killed hundreds of thousands of young businesses through no fault of the entrepreneur. And so sometimes it's true, it is other people's fault, or the universe is to blame. And at the other extreme are entrepreneurs who actually take too much responsibility for what happened. They beat themselves up. I'm not good as, I wasn't a good entrepreneur. I never will be a good entrepreneur. I never should have done this, and I should never do it again. And that's sometimes true. There are some people who are just temperamentally and psychologically ill-suited for the role, but they are rare. And it's more often the case that it's more complicated than these people. So you want to avoid those extremes unless they happen to be true, and find the space in the middle where you actually will take responsibility for what happened, understand what happened and your role in it. And if you can explain that to other people, that's actually the last aspect of a graceful shutdown. Explaining what happened, your role, and what you've learned from it, and what you will do differently next time. And an entrepreneur who's paid people who owed money, helped employees get a job, communicated clearly, and can explain what to do next, that's the entrepreneur who will bounce back stronger and gracefully.
So one thing I was thinking about, so I was speaking with an entrepreneur friend of mine. He's running a unicorn startup now, and he talked about, he gave a very good analogy. He said, Vishal, you know what? Entrepreneurship to me is like a high rope jump trick on a circus. So it's a trapeze game, and basically there's a swing going on, and then I'll jump. And in my progression, I'll just have to get 3 more jumps right, and hopefully on the other side, there's someone to catch me. Otherwise, I'll fall, and there'll be a huge spat. And then he said, what is surprising to me was, but my worry is, as an entrepreneur, I don't know whether I'm jumping or still on the swing, right? So his problem is that my anxiety point is, I can never give up till the last minute. But sometime when the thing happens, I'm already stuck on a wall, plastered there. So from and when I was listening to about your graceful exit strategy, so I wondered, like, if I combine both these philosophies, right? Don't give up till the end, or sort of jump or fall gracefully. Like, how do you come at a chord between these two theories?
One of the findings from the research is that if you talk to entrepreneurs who failed, a lot of them, many of them a pretty large fraction of them will tell you they waited too long to shut the business down, and stayed on the swing too long, I suppose, in that analogy. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. It's important to understand these reasons as an entrepreneur. There are a lot of things you have to try when the company is struggling, and each of them takes some time, right? You may do a pivot. You may sort of change your business model or target a new customer, and particularly if the company has some scale, it takes a lot of energy to move an entire company in a new direction, and then it takes time to see if the pivot is working. You're going to try to raise more money. That takes time. When that fails, if you try to raise from new investors, then you have to go back to your existing investors and try to get them to put more money in. That's incredibly emotionally fraught, basically, for a whole bunch of reasons. They've now seen that you've tried a bunch of things and they're not working. They know a lot, and they're debating whether they should throw good money after bad. You'll try to sell the company. When you can't raise more money, you'll try to sell it. And here it's tricky, because basically you're going to get a lot of interest. When you put your company up for sale, every competitor in your space is going to want to take a look. Why? Of course, they want to see what you're paying your employees and talk to you about your strategy and so forth. So, but it's deceptive. It can be very deceptive, right? They can sort of string you along and not really be interested, or work you down. So without killing you, you sort of weaken to the point where if they're going to buy you, they'll get a really good deal. So you try to sell, you try to pivot, you try some layoffs, you try a little bit of everything. And the thing about startup failure is it's rarely one decisive event. The rope on the swing breaks. It's usually a series of small wins and a larger number of small problems, and the problems are accumulating faster than the victories. But hopeful humans can always sort of see a different pattern in that data. There are other reasons, right? The identity of an entrepreneur is somebody who persists. And so if I throw in the towel, if I quit, am I a good entrepreneur? An entrepreneur has an entire team that earns its living because of the company. They get their medical, somebody's having a baby, and we shut the company down. How will they pay their medical bills? And said, investors believed in me. So there's a whole bunch of, and often the founder has a problem of just not having anybody to talk to. You got to be careful with what you tell your investors because you're trying to get them to put more money in. So you can't lie. You shouldn't lie to them, but you may not be completely honest about your doubt about whether this is going to work. You can't be completely honest with employees and transparent with employees, because if you are, they might leave, and that'll accelerate the downward spiral. So you bottle all this up. If you're lucky, your spouse, by the way, and your friends have given up on you. You're now working 80 hours a week, and you have been for the last 6 months. You've canceled the last 4 dinners with your friends. So no one has much patience for hearing you obsess about the business anymore. A lucky entrepreneur will have a peer group, like a YPO, Young Presidents Organization, or some place where people who understand them and what they're going through, they can relate. But many entrepreneurs have nobody to talk to in this phase. So it's hard. And for all these reasons, people probably wait longer than they should. If you can at least, your chance, rather than waiting for a miracle, the upside of failing gracefully, if you're going to fail, that's really a thing you want to do.
Interesting. And one more area I really want your perspective on. So Nassim Taleb, so he talks about being anti-fragile, right? So he talks about setting up guards and sort of making sure that if something happens, you come out stronger. So in a way, it's a very weird way to. So whenever even I wear my entrepreneurial hat and I read that book, it just doesn't come in accord, right? So from your vantage point, how do you grapple with that concept of being anti-fragile, and on the other side embracing failures? Like, what I'm curious to know your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of anti-fragile is it's at the system level. A system benefits from big random swings, because mistakes are going to go in every direction, but sometimes you discover penicillin. So if we allow for experimentation and do a lot of it, and are attentive to the mistakes and the random swings, we may benefit. And so I think Silicon Valley, in some ways, is an anti-fragile system. But that system is comprised of lots of individual actors, and you're going to get a lot of failure because people try things. They move, if you will, from the system's perspective in random directions, trying out a lot of different things, and most of them will fail and some of them will succeed brilliantly. And that's good for Silicon Valley system. It's good for society, but it's horrible for the individual entrepreneur, right? They don't have a portfolio of moves they're making. They make one move, and it's either in the right direction, or more likely it's in the wrong direction. So, but for whatever reason, as a species, we're wired up to have at least some fraction of our organisms that will sort of go out to the frontier and try something new. We're lucky. It's easy to imagine us being a bunch of hedgehogs and everybody goes in a hole.
Fair point. So if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm reading this book, what would you suggest? What would you suggest me, like, if I want to make myself to be resilient to failure, or it will like, what will you tell me? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, odds are high you're an early stage entrepreneur, and so I would tell you about the early stage failure patterns and how to avoid them, three big things stand out. One of the early stage failure patterns has to do with having a good idea, but not being able to mobilize the entire set of players that have to come together to make that idea a reality. I call this good idea bad bedfellows. And it's not just the founder, the jockey, it's also the other team members, it's the investors. Many entrepreneurs will have partners, right? The definition of entrepreneurship is doing something new without resources. Who has resources? Big companies. So a lot of entrepreneurs will partner with big companies, and that can be a messy business, a difficult business. And so it turns out that there's some businesses where industry experience is super crucial. I spoke in the beginning about this apparel company. That's an example of a business where you really need to know something about designing and manufacturing clothing. There are all these specialized roles: pattern maker, fabric sourcer, quality control, and they all have to fit together. And these entrepreneurs didn't have fashion industry design and manufacturing experience, so they made some mistakes in the kinds of people they brought into the company. Bad bedfellows. They couldn't attract the right investors. Bad bedfellows. The factories that actually manufactured their clothing didn't pay attention to them because they were a little peanut with no industry relationships. So their orders got pushed to the end, and in order to expedite an order for somebody else. And so industry experience turned out to have been very important there. If you look at a food and beverage startup, same thing. What kind of packaging will jump off the shelf? What's a co-packer, and how do you work with them? What are slotting allowances in grocery stores? Super crucial. All these things you can get wrong. Many of the MBAs I work with are they'll create some new beverage, and they'll think it'll just fly off the shelves magically. There are other businesses, many other businesses, where you don't need industry experience. If you launch Instagram, you don't have to really have worked in photo sharing before or have worked for Kodak. You need an intuition. People who launch dating sites all the time usually fail, but some of them succeed, don't have experience in dating services. So sometimes it's important, sometimes it isn't. An entrepreneur needs to know which they're in. That's one. The second is a false start. The risk that in their zeal to build and launch the product and move as fast as they can, because that's what an entrepreneur does, many entrepreneurs will skip upfront research. Before they start the engineering work, the customer discovery, have we really found a strong unmet customer need? And then a good designer is going to generate a lot of solutions, because there's usually many ways to solve a problem. The entrepreneur thinks he or she can see around corners and wants to get going, so they start engineering. That first version of the product is probably going to miss the mark because they've skipped this research. So they've wasted the amount of time it takes to build it, sell it, and figure out what to do next. Let's call that 4 months. In order to save 4 months of upfront research, they've wasted 4 months later. And that's a false start, and it kills a lot of startups. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, you can still pivot away from the flawed first version, but if you've only got a year's worth of capital in the bank, either because you're bootstrapping or that's how much money you were able to raise, to waste 4 months out of 12 is a bad idea. And then the last thing I tell entrepreneurs, early stage entrepreneurs, is to watch out for false positives. So it turns out that every business needs early adopters. If you're lucky as an entrepreneur, there'll be some people out there that are just banging on your door. They want your product now. They've been waiting for it for a long time. And it's very tempting to expand aggressively in the direction of those early adopters and to give them what they want, the feature set they're looking for. It's often the case that the early adopters have needs that for features that are different than those of the mainstream customers. And Dropbox is a great example, right? Drew Houston, his early adopters were software engineers, people with incredibly sophisticated requirements for file management, working on multiple devices, collaborating with other people, big files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in his Y Combinator application, he talked about wanting to create a service that was so easy to use his mother could use it to store her recipes. So he had this nuanced understanding of the difference between mainstream and early adopter, and he had the discipline to not give the early adopters what they want. Sometimes you should. and then you should migrate over time. Sometimes your mainstream product will be good enough for the early adopters. So you need to understand the difference, and you need a strategy for dealing with any difference that you find.
I think that's beautifully put. And to our listeners and viewers, so there's a love letter or a letter to first time founder that you put on the book. And by the way, fascinating work there. It was pretty remarkable, and thank you for sharing that. So and thank you for walking us through the helping us understand the failures in the startup context. So now we are in a rapid fire section of our conversation. So
Yep.
how this works is I usher out a keyword or a word, and just say whatever comes to your mind. You could just
Like word association, one word response.
or just go like whatever comes to your mind. The first thought that comes to
Okay.
your mind. Love to know your perspective. So
Got it. So you're like a psychiatrist.
startups,
Startups, upstarts.
entrepreneurship,
We have a definition at Harvard Business School: pursuing novel opportunity before you have all the resources you need to capture that opportunity. So doing something new without having enough. That's entrepreneurship.
interesting. Failures,
Misunderstood, oversimplified.
growth,
Key to success and failure.
culture,
I love Ben Horowitz, the venture capitalist at Andreessen Horowitz, defines culture. I love his definition. It's what employees do when their boss isn't around.
founder,
The heroes for society.
disruption,
Misunderstood. A lot of people think they understand what the late Clay Christensen, was talking about without reading his book. So read the book is my response to disruption.
that's a fair point. Uh, jobs of future,
Jobs of the future, dispersed, more so than today.
future of
Thank you,
startups.
COVID.
Yeah.
Future of startups,
Yeah.
dispersed, more so than in the, thank you, COVID. We won't just be in London, Berlin, Mumbai, and San Francisco. It'll be all over the place
Future of
because
leadership.
we can work from home. Sorry?
Future of leadership.
Same as the past. Humans don't change that fast.
Thank you for playing with us that. And now we are at the tail end of the conversation, and I want to spend few minutes on your journey. So we ask all of our guests to talk about some things that has helped them shape what they have become. Like what qualities would you attribute to your current success?
So have you ever talked to your audience about hedgehog and fox?
No.
So do a Google search when we get done. That's a wonderful essay by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He uses it to explain Tolstoy of all things, but it's a bigger concept than just one person. And it goes back to Aesop's fables, where the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And so the fox is an omnivore, will eat anything and rove all over the place, scavenging and hunting and so forth. The hedgehog just eats one thing, and the one big thing it knows is how to roll up in a ball and protect itself, sort of by putting its spikes out. And Isaiah Berlin would say that we all have an intellectual style that's either hedgehog or fox. So the hedgehog has one big idea and a hammer, and everywhere they're pounding down with that hammer. And my late colleague Christensen was exactly the hedgehog. He saw disruption everywhere he looked, and he had a wonderful hammer for pounding on it. And my other colleague, Michael Porter, I think I see his book right behind you, Competitive Strategy, is the consummate fox, who never saw an idea he didn't like and had a brilliant mind for connecting all the ideas together. We need both. Both types of thinkers can move the world forward. I'm a fox. Never met an idea I didn't love, and I think that's reflected in my book, and in the whole style of the way I do research. Um, there's a disciplined lack of discipline when you're a fox. You need to cast a very wide net. I mean, from the number of books and diversity of books behind you, I suspect you're a fox too.
Yes, I think that's the most eloquent way someone answered this. So thank you for that. So we ask all of our guests to share some of their favorite reads. Like
There,
what?
say it again.
So some of
Oh,
some
for
of your
favorite
favorite
reads.
reads, some of the books that really shaped you, or some of the
Yeah,
books that
yeah.
you love.
Um, Novels, Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. Serious sort of academic book. Um, there's a book by Graham Allison on the Cuban Missile Crisis. God, I can't believe I don't remember the title, but if you just do Graham Allison and Cuban Missile Crisis, it'll pop out of Amazon. And what I love about the book is he's a fox. He comes at it from three different perspectives: a sociological perspective, a game theoretic perspective, and I forget what the third is, sort of a political bureaucracy perspective, and each explanation for why the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded the way it did. And then at the end, he tries to bring them together, and he doesn't succeed, but it's a noble effort. The book had a big influence on the way a fox thinks about. I read it when I was a doctoral student. One of my favorites.
Interesting. So, last but not the least, if you want something for our listeners and viewers to take
The book
away,
is, it came into my brain, The Essence of Decision.
Essence of Decision.
Essence of Decision.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So, if you want something our listeners and viewers to take away from this conversation, like what would that be? What would be your parting thought?
Yeah. So it goes. You mentioned, you called it a love letter. I think that's it. It's not what I called it, but it is a good way to talk about the way I end the book. And I'll end this conversation the same way, which is entrepreneurs get lots of advice, and the advice is rooted in our conventional wisdom about what makes for a great entrepreneur. And most of the advice is good most of the time, but if you follow it blindly, it can actually boost your odds of failure. So entrepreneurs here grow, right? To succeed as we've already established, growing too fast, growing unprofitably can cause problems. Be frugal because you've got limited resources. True. But sometimes you need industry expertise. And if you don't have it, if you don't hire it, and if that person is expensive and you're too frugal, you can kill your company. Be focused. But to your anti-fragile point, sometimes you need to try a lot of things and create some options so you can expand in the direction and sort of have option theory. So I could go on and on like this. Be persistent. If persistence turns into stubbornness, then you can fail to pivot when the universe is telling you your idea isn't working very well. And so at the core of all this, you hear a lot, if you're an entrepreneur, about trusting your gut, trusting your instinct. And I suspect your friend on the trapeze thinks this way, sort of, my instinct will tell me, my gut will tell me when to let go and sort of jump from one place to the other. And again, that's a big asset for an entrepreneur, moving nimbly, especially if you're competing with big, slow corporations. But there's some set of decisions, and Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about system one thinking and system two thinking. System one, sort of the flash of intuition, what a firefighter has to do when he walks into a burning building, sort of make a split-second decision about which way to go, versus system two, deliberate planning, trade-offs, pros and cons, all that stuff. And we need both, and an entrepreneur needs both, because if you trust your gut on the big decisions, who should be my co-founder? Should I take money from this company? Have I got the right customer segment? If you trust your gut and you move too quickly, your gut will be racked by emotions and will cloud your decision making. So slow down is the last advice. Slow down, think some of these decisions through, and sleep on it 2 nights. Write up the pros and cons. Share them with somebody smart who understands you and understands your business, and just slow down a little bit.
Beautifully put. And with that, thank you so much for your time. And I'm curious, what's next for Why Startups Fail?
For the project,
Yes.
um, um, I mean, there's a ton of work. I'm interested in questions around gender. It turns out that female-founded startups fail at about the same rate as male, but females are less likely to found again after their startup has failed, and we don't know why. It's hard to believe they aren't just as good as entrepreneurs as if their first version failed at the same rate. Why don't they come back and do it again? So questions like that. I haven't spent enough time in an international context. There's whole sets of business. I mean, a lot of the work is grounded in tech startups, which is what I know. But there are many other kinds of businesses out there. I want to see the extent to which these ideas generalize across a range of different types of businesses.
Awesome. So with that, Tom, wish you nothing but success on the book. You're always welcome back on the podcast. To our listeners and viewers, there'll be a description on where to get the book from. And Tom, so where can people read about you?
Yeah, so probably the best way is just to find me on Twitter. It's my last name, Eisenmann with a T in front, Eisenmann at Eisenmann on Twitter, and that'll steer you to my Harvard Business School bio page and so forth.
Awesome. With that, thank you so much for your time, and wish you nothing but success and good luck.
Thanks, Vishal. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So I was homesick, never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick.